Let's look at examples of using constraints in Onshape sketches. The definition of a constraint is a limitation or restriction. Let's begin by opening a sketch, selecting a sketch plane, and begin with the line tool, drawing a random shape. As you build your sketch, you see that constraints can be added automatically. Our first two lines were automatically constrained to be horizontal and vertical. You can also use inferred lines as you add some angles. Now you can see we are getting a perpendicular constraint automatically added. If you don't want it to use the automatic constraint, hold the Shift key down and those automatic constraints will not snap to your sketch. And a convenient one is when it snaps to the endpoint of a line segment so that you can enclose that sketch. Let's explore the changes we can make based on the constraints that are on this sketch. If you hover your mouse over a line segment or a point, you can see the constraints that are applied to it pop up. For example, here, this is the coincident constraint, and it shows us that those two line segments highlighted in yellowish green are coincident at the endpoint. And here, if we hover over this, we get a line. This vertical line is perpendicular to the horizontal line. We don't have constraints there, except at the endpoints where they are coincident, meaning they have the endpoints of this line and this line occupy the same space. Again, here, this line, we get the perpendicular. If we click on that, if you would like, you can delete a constraint. Right? So now I can click and drag and make that angle have a variety of angle measurements. Let's go ahead and undo that and go back to having the perpendicular constraint. Another way to look at the constraints on your sketch is to select Show Constraints in the Sketch dialog box. Once you select that, you can see all the constraints as they're applied to your sketch. So as you hover the cursor over a constraint, it will highlight the entities it is applied to. For example, right here, this coincident applies to those two highlighted line segments. And then we can go over here and find this perpendicular constraint applies to those two highlighted segments, and so on. Let's say you wanted to remove this constraint so you can add another line segment. Just click on it and press delete, and then you can click and drag that open. Let's say we're going to go ahead and add another line segment. And let's say you wanted to you wanted this corner to be perpendicular. Okay, so explore your shape and see which things you can change and which ones, right? See how those two line segments remain on the same line. And some of them remain, right? This one, some angles can change and others remain fixed. And this angle has to remain perpendicular. Let's manually add a constraint. Let's make maybe this line and this line parallel. And we can deselect it. And let's see what happens as, right, we try to change that line. It remains parallel. So let's go ahead, right? Let's say we want to click on that constraint. We don't want those to be parallel anymore. And now, right, so you can make a variety of changes. Those lines are obviously not parallel any longer. Let's compare the constraints coincident and concentric. Start with the sketch, choose the front plane. Let's go ahead and make a circle. And let's make a rectangle. Coincident is when two entities share the same location. Entities could be endpoints, center points, lines, or curves. The constraint coincident looks like this. And let's say we want the center of the circle and one of the corners of the rectangle to be coincident. That means, right, they share the same location. So click on the 2 points you would like to be coincident. And there you are. Again, let's deselect that tool. If we hover over it, and we should be able to see the coincident. So that coincident constraint is for the two sides of the rectangle. This one is coincident for the circle and the rectangle. So if we wanted to delete it, we can click on it and press delete. And now I can go ahead and, oops, I wanted to move my circle. Let's put that back about that size. So again, if they had remained coincident, and I go to change the shape of my rectangle, the center of the circle remains coincident with the upper left corner. And notice, since these lines are blue, I can still change them around, unless, of course, you had given it a dimension. Now, I can't change the size of that circle, but I can still move it around. Let's go ahead and change the coincident to concentric. Concentric means that two entities have the same center location. There we go. I can move the circle. Now let's make them concentric. Here's the concentric constraint. If I click the center of the rectangle and the circle, and I deselect that tool, and so as I make changes, they will remain concentric. But their location is not fixed, so I can move that around. It's also possible to make your points or lines coincident with some of the reference geometry, the origin, the top plane, front plane, or right plane. So if we select coincident and we want this point coincident with the origin, notice how the entire shape shifted to have that point coincident. Now let's say we want this line to be coincident with this plane. And let's say we want this line coincident with this plane. Now if I hide those planes, you can see that some of the lines are now black. Black lines in a sketch are defined by constraints or dimensions. Blue lines in a sketch are underdefined or free to move. Let's deselect our constraint tool and see what changes we can make to the shape. So you can try to move this point, but you are not allowed. Let's see. Let's try. Okay, that we can only move because that line is constrained to that plane. That one's okay. All right, that one's constrained to be vertical, so we can move that. Remember, those two segments were constrained to be on the same line, so they will always move together. How about this line? Okay. Yeah, it is constrained to be perpendicular. Let's explore some other constraints. Let's go ahead and add a circle to this line. Notice an automatic constraint pops up. You see the line with the dot. That is the midpoint constraint. That means if I choose to make my circle here, click for the center and then make it bigger, that it is constrained to the midpoint of that line. Let's see what that means. So deselect the circle tool. All right. So if I try to move that point, it's going to maintain itself in the midpoint of that line segment. And to compensate, it will make the line longer or shorter. I encourage you to go to the Help menu and look up constraints in the Help menu, and specifically go to Working with Constraints. And often I want you to notice that there are video examples in the Help section of Onshape.